Sorry, can you use this one? Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Maritime Museum Tasmania Lunchtime Talks Series. This month, I'll start by, I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of Nipaluna, Hobart, where we meet today, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge the continuing connection to Tasmanian Aboriginal people to land, sea and waterways. And today we are very pleased to welcome Richie Woolley. Richie grew up in Judbury in the Huon Valley and is a keen family and local historian and author. He has spent many years researching and walking the landscape of Recherche Bay, I have to say it in French, one of Tasmania's most historically layered places. Today, Richie will be speaking about Bennetts points and Fisher points, including the garden and observatory sites linked to the 1792 and 1793 French expedition led by Bruni, as well as previously unrecorded ruins associated with Captain William Fisher and his family. Please join me in welcoming Richie Woolley.
Drink of water first. You can see the first slide up there with its suitably grand title for the talk, some Recherche Bay archaeology and its historical context. My trusty sidekick, when asked what it was that he and I did down there over more than a decade, had a different answer, and I think in many ways would make a better title. Because that's exactly what we did. We wandered around and stumbled over things from time to time. You can tell from the name of my trusty sidekick that he's also from the Huon, and if you thought about it, you could probably guess where he came from. Correct, he's a Geeston lad. So a pair of old Huon boys wandering around. Now, we've had the lovely French accent describe this place to the south as Recherche Bay, which is indeed the French pronunciation. But as an old-timer from the Huon, it has only ever been Recherche Bay to me. And you can see that particular pronunciation goes back quite some time, and that's the one that I use. Indeed, I've been known to get a little bit annoyed if people use the other. Now, I'm presuming most people will know where Recherche Bay is. Quick show of hands, have you been there? Okay, so it's certainly not everyone by any stretch of the imagination. The best way to describe it is if you get in your car and you drive south and go as far as you can, then you'll finish up at Recherche Bay, right in the southernmost portion of the state. If you haven't been, I recommend going. It's a lovely area, and if the weather's okay, I'm sure you'll enjoy yourself. Now, that's what it looks like on a good day. Mountains in the background, there are some wonderful white sandy beaches. It really is a lovely spot. I have a reasonably long-standing association with the area, though I've never lived there, because my family, who lived at Lonavale in the Upper Huon, used to go down there for an annual holiday at the end of the small fruit picking season. So when the raspberries and the black currants had all been picked, everybody would troop down to Cockle Creek for a holiday. Now, the gentleman at the front with a cigarette in his mouth is my grandfather, Claude Woolley. The other gentleman with the hat on is his brother Ron, and one of Ron's sons, and the disembodied leg that you can see off to the right, that belongs to Walter Adams, who was the husband of the much more famous Rose Adams, who was a well-known Cockle Creek identity. So family holidays down that area were very popular, and they were known to pop over to South Cape Bay just to have an interchange with some of the locals who were pretty tasty. Now you can see second from the right is Uncle Ron again, my great uncle, and that's my father next to him. And with all the flair and imagination that our family has always had, Dad's name was also Ron. So not too much trouble with the names, a good one will do for a few generations. So that's a family group, one of my other uncles there and a cousin as well. So anyone who went down that way in the period through to about the mid-1970s would be aware that the road was horrendous. Very, very poor. Now, corduroy roads, generally speaking, logs are set across the road. But in some sections of the old track down to Recherche Bay, for some strange reason, the corduroy was parallel to the road. So you'd be driving over those and a wheel would fall off a log into the gap beside it, get bogged. It was a nightmare. So the road was really atrocious. And it was only in the mid-1970s when a forestry road was adopted and linked up to the rest of it that travel down there became a little bit more easy. That's not always the case, however. There are still some problems potentially these days. On one of my trips down there, I had something of a wait while the road was cleared by people with a chainsaw, fortunately, who were going in the other direction. Now, this would have been okay if I'd been about 20 minutes later, because they would have shifted everything by then. But having arrived while the work was still going on, I felt obliged to help out. So in life, timing is everything, and I got that slightly wrong. I should have been a little bit later. But you can see over on the side there a reference to D'Entrecasteaux's watering place. Now, as you would be aware, one of the things that I wish to talk about today is something to do with the D'Entrecasteaux expedition in the 1790s. If you cast your mind back, you'll remember that there was quite a deal of argy-bargy about the area in the early 2000s. This was one of the articles that was published in the paper at the time, where there was much discussion about the garden that had been established during the French expedition having been found. You see that on the left there, and also a reference to the stone wall at the observatory site. Now, that was interesting, but I was always a little bit concerned about those identifications because there seemed to be no understanding that there had been a lot of activity in some of these areas since the arrival of the French expedition. So in my mind, it was always doubtful that artefacts from that time would have survived, and particularly in one or two locations, as I'll point out as we go along. I must say I was quite happy with the outcome of all this when the logging didn't go ahead, but I was just a little bit concerned about some of the claims that were made for some of these features. So, this is a map from the time, printed shortly after the expedition, and you can see Observatory Point down here on the bottom side, and further up the bay, the approximate site of the garden. These maps, of course, are widely available and were widely available at the time. So those two areas, Observatory Point and the garden, were things that were of great interest to me. And as well as using documentary sources when I'm doing research, I love to get on the ground and walk about and have a look and see what you can see. So in a desire to check all this out, it was necessary to go down there. Now you can see the road into research there, the red line on the left, and you'll note Pigsties Bay, which is the northern portion of Research Bay, Coal Pit Bight, which is the approximate site of the garden, is on the other side of the bay, and there are no roads to get there. So that was the first problem, how do you get there? Now I don't own a boat, so I decided, despite the fact that I'd never paddled in my life, perhaps I could get a kayak and paddle across the bay to get to these areas of interest. So that's what I did. It was quite an interesting experience. At the start I was just doing this by myself, but I had a fall on one trip over there, and as I was lying on my back on a rock platform, I thought, gee, it'd be good to have a second person along, wouldn't it? So that's when I contacted my friend Andrew Jeeves, and he was only too willing to join me in the little excursions. So that was my method for getting across the water, to have a look at the site of the garden and the observatory. So, the garden. What is actually there? These are some photographs I took of the arrangement of stones in the garden site that had been mentioned in that earlier newspaper article. You can see a number of lines intersecting, and there's also a feature in the middle of it, a rectangular built-up area of stones as well in the middle, somewhat disrupted by a couple of large trees, but still obviously there. Now there was a scientific investigation of the site back in 2006, and they mapped out the location of those stones. Now, you'll recall this was put forward as the site of the garden. It's roughly the right size in terms of its overall measurements, and it's in roughly the right place as well. But the garden was supposedly divided into 4 sections, and for the life of me, I can't see how there aren't 5 in that particular map of the stones. So that's the first thing that would raise some concerns. Now, I mentioned the rectangular, almost square formation, which has been mapped there in the middle on the left-hand side, and that immediately stood out to me as something that was worthy of note. We'll get to that in a moment as to what that might indicate. So this was the conclusions of the scientific investigation, and they decided that they didn't think it was the garden either. Indeed, they suggested that it was probably an uncompleted structure associated with the late 19th and early 20th century development of the area. I happen to agree with that, and one of the reasons, that little squarish rectangular feature that you can see over there, based on one of the other lateral lines, looks to me for all the world like the base for a planned double-sided chimney. Now that looks so familiar to me because I grew up in a house that had exactly that at Judbury, a double-sided chimney. So that to me, they didn't mention that, but that particular feature suggested to me that they were quite right, that this was indeed a floor plan for a building that was never actually constructed. I agreed with that, but I wasn't happy to leave it there. If this was a building that was planned to be built sometime in that more modern era, I wanted to see if I could learn anything more about it. So that necessitated quite a bit of archival work, but what I eventually found was this little survey diagram of a block of land that takes in the area of that building, which was applied for. It was Crown land, but it was applied for by August Oden. Now the date is interesting. This was applied for in 1891, and those of you who are familiar with Tasmanian history would know that there was a fairly significant economic depression that descended on the state at that time. Now, Mr. Oden was a timber mill worker, and what happened when the depression hit was that the Laprina sawmill closed. So in this area, people needed work, and when a sawmill closed, people would leave the district. So Mr. Oden never completed the purchase of this particular block of land. It reverted to the Crown. He next is known at Bruni Island, and later on he also came back to Hastings, where he was also working in sawmills. So my conjecture would be that we're actually looking at the plan for a dwelling for the Oden family, which was never completed because the sawmill closed and the family left the district. So those pieces all fit together. So I'm reasonably happy that this is further evidence that that site is in fact not the garden, and is, as was concluded by the scientific investigation, a floor plan for a building that wasn't constructed. Mr. Oden, as I said, returned to the Hastings area, and although you wouldn't know it, there is actually a cemetery at Hastings. If you go through the bush, you'll find it, and this is a headstone erected after the death of one of his children. I think it was 1901, is that right? Yes, I think I see it there. In 1901, when he'd returned to the district. He was living in the Hastings area at that time. So that's the first thing. The French garden, what has been identified by some as the French garden anyway, I don't think it is. I think it's a building that relates to later activity. And this was the point that worried me when these things were first discussed. There seemed to be no recognition that other things had happened in the area in the period since the French were there. So, the next one, the observatory wall that was mentioned. You may recall from that newspaper article, it was about 20 metres long, about 1 metre high, lovely stone wall that had been found down there. This is the end of it, and you can see it moving back through the bush. And this is another shot of it. You can see the wall in the background. You can also see a row of stones that's about 1.5 metres from the wall that continues parallel to it, with a built-up area in between those two. Now, that might remind you of something, and we'll come back to what it reminds me of shortly. So that's the wall in the area of the observatory. Now, this particular area has been heavily utilised over the period since the French expedition was down there. And I've got a bit of a summary there of some of the things that have gone on over that period. Of particular significance, the references to the Ryan family, who had a house built in this area and lived there for, well, getting on towards 25 years. You can see various other things. This area was called McIntyre's Point at one stage, called Bennetts Point at another. That Bennetts Point label seems to have first been applied when there was a ship built there by William Bennett. Not the only ship built in the Recherche Bay area, but certainly that particular one is probably the only one on that side of the bay. I mentioned Lady Franklin in that list, and when she visited the area in 1838, firstly she thought the smell was atrocious because this was in the whaling era and there were carcasses, whale carcasses, spread throughout the bay, and she commented on just how unpleasant the odour was there. But you can see this is the Bennetts Point area that she's talking about, where the observatory was, and she's commenting about how heavily that's being used. Now this is 1838, so that's not so long after the French were there, and it's already being heavily used. So anything that was there at an earlier stage will be struggling to survive. This is a little survey diagram from 1863 when the boat was built, and quite handily, the boat was even drawn on the survey diagram, so we have no doubt that that's where it was built, and you can see some huts. And that particular vessel, now I'm never quite sure how to pronounce the name of that, whether it's Sangalia or some other variation, I'm not sure, but that was the particular vessel that was built down there in 1864. This was built by the Bennett family, which is how the name Bennett's Point eventually came to be attached to this particular area. Now, a key moment in my investigations here was this photograph, which was published in the Tasmanian Mail in 1898. Now, the caption was La Perouse from the pigsties, which isn't terribly helpful in identifying where it is. But if you go to Bennett's Point and take a photograph, you can see exactly where it is. It's a photograph of Bennett's Point. There's no doubt about that. If you compare the rocks in the foreground and the mountains in the background, it's clearly that that photograph is actually at Bennett's Point. As you can see, the similarity again. Now, there are lots of interesting things in this. Firstly, you can see some whale bones still in that area in 1898, some in the foreground, some also in the background. You can see the standalone jetty there in the harbour. The purpose of that was the sawmills that were further up the bay. Large vessels couldn't get up there to pick up the timber. So the timber was transferred down to this freestanding jetty, and the larger vessels then came to this particular jetty to take on board the timber. So that's what that was all about. You can see a little man in his boat. Probably they came in the larger boat that's moored at the jetty there, I would suggest. So that's this Bennett's Point area in 1898. Now, this is an enlargement of part of that. Again, all sorts of interesting features. I'm guessing that the white material that you can see is probably whalebone. There's this strange feature in the left corner over there. I'm not altogether sure what exactly that is, with the long boom stretching out and a rope or something hanging down from it. But there's one thing that you just don't see in this particular photograph, and that is a stone wall. So this is 1898. It tells us that that stone wall wasn't built until after this point. So we can categorically say that the stone wall wasn't anything to do with the observatory. Some people have suggested it might have been linked to the boat building, but again, that was in 1863. Here we are, 1898, no stone wall. It seems almost certain that that stone wall was actually constructed by Mr. Ryan. This area is very stony, but we know that Mr. Ryan had an orchard and grew vegetables and that sort of thing. So to make that happen, a lot of that stone had to be moved. And if you're going to move the stone, why not do something useful with it? Like build a wall, or if you cast your mind back to that earlier photograph, possibly a garden bed against the wall. So that's what I think this feature is here. This delineates a garden bed. You can see how it's raised behind those rocks. So that particular thing, again, suggests that it's all linked to when the Ryan family was living there. Indeed, there is a reference in 1902 when Mr. Ryan was asked to pay some money for use of the shore reservation where his construction had extended to. And that wall actually is right on the boundary of the shore reservation. So it all fits together perfectly there, that in fact is nothing to do with the French observatory, which if there were remnants there, unfortunately, they've been lost over time due to the activity in this particular area. There are lots of things that relate to the Ryan's house there. You can see a nice little brick section here. There are other artefacts scattered around in this area. So there's plenty of evidence for the Ryans and their house and farm that they had in this particular area. And there's another stone wall. If you walk around the coastline a little bit further, you come to another very similar stone wall, which, as it happens, fronts another block that was owned by John Ryan. So we're getting a little bit of a trend here. Mr. Ryan, in clearing areas for his agricultural pursuits, liked to build a stone wall. And there's also another large stone mound here which corresponds to the corner of one of his blocks. So this is some sort of surveyor's mark, or has been built up from a surveyor's mark, delineating the end of his land. So lots of these stone features can be found in all sorts of parts of the bay, not just over here in this particular area, but in others as well. So again, lots of features, but all related to much later activity than the French expedition. The only thing that I found that had anything to do, or that I could be sure had anything to do with the French expedition, was this little marker, which was put in 1992 to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the establishment of the observatory. That's just in amongst the rocks, very close to the shoreline. I didn't actually know it was there, I just stumbled across it. But there it is, and as I say, that's about the only thing that I found in all my years of wandering around there that can be definitively linked to the French expedition. And that is certainly a modern artefact. So, that's the area on the northeast peninsula, as it's sometimes called, where the possible but unlikely French remains were found. So I've also wanted to talk about Fisher's Point. Fisher's Point, as you might guess, is named after Captain William Fisher, who was mentioned at the start, where he and his family lived at a particular point in the 19th century. Now, where this is, you can see on the map, this is the bottom side of Recherche Bay, and Fisher's Point is out on more or less the open ocean. It's south of Bruni Island, so it's not shielded as part of the channel, and there's Pancake Bay just to the south of that. Something else that I want to draw your attention to is the feature called Snake Point. Now, there's a reason, as I've discovered over the years, why that name might have been chosen. And it's not just there, but large black wriggly things are enormously common in the Recherche Bay area, and I don't like them. In fact, most of the field work that we've done down there has been done in the cooler months. I don't care if it's frosty or it's wet, that's fine. Just don't get me too close to these wriggly black fellows. And I also have a policy, that's me, that's a cutting in another part of the bay. You'll notice my footwear. I might be one of the few people who blunders about the bush in gumboots, but I do, and that's all because of my dislike for snakes. I derive a certain amount of comfort from having the gumboots on. It's not always terribly comfortable, but I'd rather feel that I don't have to worry about the snakes. I might add my friend Andrew Jeeves is no better than I am when it comes to snakes, and many's the time when the leader, whoever's been in front, there'll be a strangled cry, "Dah!" and a dash to the left or right, and the guy following on behind knows exactly what's going on. So, Fisher's Point. If you've been down there, you've probably walked out to the pilot station, the brick remains out at Fisher's Point. In the 1830s, 3 vessels were lost in the southern end of D'Entrecasteaux Channel. The most famous of those is the King George III, of course, the convict transport that ran onto the rock that was subsequently named King George III rock. So it was decided to station a pilot down there. He started work in 1836, and later on, in about 1842, a brick building was built to house the pilot and his crew. These bricks were made at the Southport Probation Station, and I just love them because look at the character in these bricks. No two bricks are alike. They've all got this marvellous sort of texture and weave in them. I could stand there and look at the rocks in this, look at the bricks in this building for ages because, as I say, no two are the same, all made by convict labour at the Southport Probation Station. So, fascinating building. And there are lots of other indicators around that area, of course, that this has been a site for European activity, including some fuchsia bushes. There are lots of lilies that grow in the general area. If you're there at the right time, you see those in flower as well. And there's also some information boards there. And this is one. And I disagree with just about everything that's written on there. Now, you can see at the height of Bay whaling, 1,000 men. I think that's a considerable exaggeration. At the most, there were 7 to 8 whaling stations. A typical size for the station would be 25, 30 men, maybe a few more. So if you multiply 8 by 30, you get something like 240, if my maths is reasonably accurate, which, even allowing for a little bit of underestimation, is well short of 1,000. So I don't think that can possibly be right. It talks about the 1850s. Over 40 ex-convicts were working as whalers or sawyers at the bay. Well, yes, but I think just saying over 40 undersells that particular one. There are reports of between 400 and 500 people working in this area in the 1850s. This was a timber boom that was triggered by the gold rush in Victoria. Lots of people flooded there. There was a demand for timber and prices skyrocketed, and there was a rush to places like Recherche Bay because timber was easily accessible and can be shipped directly to Melbourne. So in the 1850s, there was a huge boom in the transient population. As I say, if there were 400 to 500 people living in the area, then I'll wager that there were more than 40 ex-convicts in that lot, given the time. We're talking about 1854, that sort of era. So, unquestionably more. The pilot station was leased by ex-whaler Captain Fisher and Samuel Claxton as a licensed public house. Not true, and I'll tell you why shortly. At this time, there were 2 public houses on Fisher's Point. Not true, there was one. Both named the Sawyer's Arms. That is true. Both the public houses were named the Sawyer's Arms, but there's a document that says they were 3 miles apart. So they're not both at Fisher's Point. And even though the name is Fisher's Point, it wasn't Mr. Fisher that had the pub there, and I'll show you why. So these are some little items from the documentary records that you can find. The first one, January 1852, you can see a man called John Thomas was given permission to occupy the pilot station. Yeah, £10 a year rent and keeping the buildings in repair. And then you'll see by July 1853, a man called Richard Woolley, wonderful name, but no relation, was receiving a request from the Surveyor General to tell him, how is it that you're occupying the pilot station at Recherche Bay? And you can see there's a subsequent reference later that same year, the Sawyer's Arms, Recherche Bay, Richard Woolley and William Carver were the publicans for that particular public house. Now, William Carver was actually Richard Woolley's father-in-law, and Richard Woolley was a former convict who had in fact served in the boat crew at the pilot station. So he wasn't someone who's just swanned into the area. He knew about it because during his term as a convict, he had actually worked for the pilot at that station, worked for John Bruce. You can see here a reference from January 1855, nominating Richard. That spelling is actually possibly the right spelling, W-H-A-L-L-E-Y, but it's often converted to what I like to think is the premier spelling of Woolley. So again, there he is, identified, 1856, and it shows that Richard Woolley, 1L, that's a no-no, was renting this from J. Thomas, and you'll remember he was listed as the guy that was renting it from the government. So it's been sublet to Richard Woolley, and he and his father-in-law have been using it as a hotel. And you can see there the lease actually passed to Richard in 1857. The first reference to William Fisher having any association with the former pilot station dates, as you can see from this last reference, to June 1866. Now that's long after the period when those hotels were in operation, so there's no doubt that the hotel that was operated there in the 1850s was run by Carver and Woolley rather than Mr. Fisher. But as this shows, he did come into the area in 1866. And that's confirmed by valuation rolls published in the Hobart Town Gazette. And you can go through these more or less year by year because they're published fairly regularly. And you can see there is 1867, so just after that approval for him to rent it. William Fisher, the Queen, 5 acres. That continues on until 1878 when we have William Fisher, the Queen, 5 acres still, but also bushland, William Fisher, 10 acres. He had actually bought a nearby block of land that was 10 acres in size at that time. And you can see the relationship between those two properties continues until 1882. And then in 1883, the pilot station disappears and suddenly house and land, William Fisher, 10 acres in this area. So in other words, what that's telling us is that by 1883, William Fisher had built a new house on his own land. You can find out a bit more about what sort of house he had built because in 1909, this is well after his death, but his wife still lived there for some time. This property, Woodbine, fronting on Pancake Bay, which is the area just south of Fisher's Point, is up for sale. And it was actually quite a significant house. You can see reading about that there. It wasn't a small place. He's got, by this stage, he's added some extra land, and it was 6 rooms. So that's quite a substantial dwelling for the time. I might add, he and his wife, who lived there, second wife, from 1883, it wasn't necessarily a happy place for them. 2 of their sons set out to row come sail to Hobart in 1890 and never made it. Their bodies were never found, but they died. And a third son in 1906, after William Fisher himself had died, but while his wife, his widow, was still living there, another of their sons was killed when a mill train that he'd hopped on for a ride got out of control and crashed. So 3 of their sons died in fairly tragic circumstances, so it wasn't necessarily a happy place for them. But there it is, up for sale in 1909, a substantial house. Now we can learn something about where this might have been because there's no record, there was no previous record of this place ever being identified in the area. This little diagram from 1893, there are a couple of interesting things on there. If you look very carefully, just opposite the bay of Pancake Bay, if you come inland, you can see orchard and garden and a little rectangle with the word house on it. Now, I'll show you a close-up of that in a moment. But there's something significant here too. The block of land that William Fisher bought in 1883 is actually this one at the bottom. 9 acres, no roods and 16 perches. You can see the house is actually on a block of land that he bought in 1893. So what this is actually suggesting is that he built his house in the wrong place. It wasn't actually on his land. And it's later on he's realised, oops, I think I'd better buy this bit of land, otherwise I'm in a bit of strife here. So it does seem that he may have built his house. You can see it's just off the boundary of the block of land he actually bought. So the likely explanation for that is he actually built the house in the wrong spot. Here, if we go in a little bit closer, you can see that now, I hope, with the house portion underlined. So I had that. This map showed where his house was. So that then I thought, well, I've got to find that because it was an unknown place. So I got my ruler and pen out and drew a grid all over this map and matched features like the pilot station. What are the GPS coordinates for the pilot station? Can I find another feature, GPS coordinates for that? Work out where this house site was in relation to these other items that I could securely put in place, and then go and have a look for where I thought it would be. Now, it wasn't an instant success because it took me 3 goes to find it. The first time I didn't find anything. I got seduced. There was a lovely open area with just ferns and so forth, and I got seduced and wandered around in that looking for the remains of the house and didn't find anything. In fact, that area may have been where William Fisher did something for which he was actually renowned. And it's not the first thing you'd think of, but he was actually well known for growing cabbages. There was a ready market, of course, because even though the bay whaling had ceased, the whalers who toured around the southern portion of the state would call in to research for wood and water and vegetables if they could get them. And William Fisher was famous. His cabbages were commented on in the local press. There was another guy, William Caldwell, who was also a former whaler, who also grew lots of cabbages. Some of them came up to Hobart to be sold, but quite a few will have been sold to the visiting whalers. So Recherche Bay, what's it famous for? Growing cabbages. On the second time that I went to look for the Fisher house, I found the rubbish dump. And you can see all sorts of things here, some broken crockery, some bottle or two in this rubbish dump area, and this old, rather nice iron pot, another bottle. There's quite a bit of stuff there. But on that second trip, although I could find this, I couldn't find the house site, even though I knew I must be close. They're not going to walk a mile away and throw out their rubbish. So I knew I was in the right area. And in fact, as I later realised, I'd walked possibly within 2 metres of one of the chimneys from that house site, because on the third trip, I found it. So this is some of the foundations you can see here. You can also see in the background some tree ferns. It's one of the things that I've realised over the years, if you're poking around and you see some tree ferns that, well, they don't look as if they should really be growing here, have a closer look, because for whatever reason, they're often associated with areas that have been disturbed by human activity in this particular neck of the woods. So this, lot of it was hiding under the dead fronds from the tree ferns, which is why I'd missed it the first 2 times. There's one of the chimneys. Again, this was all tucked in under the dead fronds. And there's another one of the chimneys. Again, there's been some dead material cleared away there so that you could see part of that with its lovely crop of moss and lichen growing on it. And lots of other artefacts around now. This is one of my favourite. This is an old bottle of Wolf's aromatic schnapps. Now, this was advertised in the newspapers in the 1890s and into the first years of the 20th century, and it was promoted as something that was great for your health. If you really want to be fit, get your Wolf's aromatic schnapps. So they obviously tried it. I don't know how it worked, but it was good just to find that mentioned in the press, and here it is, an empty bottle of that. So this is the house area of the Fisher family at Fisher's Point, which, as I say, was unknown until this foolhardy chap who didn't like snakes decided it was worth looking for. Now, in all this, as you've seen, I haven't found a lot that relates to the French expedition. So I thought I'd finish this talk with something that is a nod to the French. The end. I'm more than happy to take